Okay, good evening and welcome to one and all. A pleasure to see so many familiar faces and less familiar faces, but wonderful to see so many faces on this Thursday night. Let me make a couple quick public service announcements just up front before we start. One is everyone is muted, but the chat is open. So if questions or comments come up at any point over the course of Rabbi Dr. Flatto's talk, please feel free to use the chat. And we're going to leave some time at the end for Dr. Flatto to entertain questions and comments. It's a book launch. We're not able to provide you the book through Zoom. That would violate the copyright laws of the United States, and we don't want to mess with Harvard University Press, but we do want you to have the book. So we've arranged, Dr. Flatto very graciously has arranged for a discount code to be distributed to everyone who's on tonight's call. Rabbi Buchler is going to post it in the chat, and then you can go straight to Harvard University Press website. There it is in the chat. You can go straight to the Harvard University Press website, and you can purchase the book, which I highly recommend that you do. One final reminder, and that's just to join us often. Lots of classes going on throughout the week, programs, Zoom events, Torah learning opportunities. So we would love to see you. We'd love to see you often. I'm going to just make a quick comment, and then I want to give Rabbi Dr. Flatto his full time. You know, one of the messages that I always think about when we read the Parshios at the beginning of Shmos and we learn about Yetzias Mitzrayim is the message of moral clarity in the face of everything that stands opposed to moral clarity. So here was this monstrous Pharaoh enlisting his people to do monstrous things, and there doesn't seem to be an opposing voice. You know, the famous Gemara that Paro took counsel with three wise men. There's Bilam, there's Eov, and there's Yisro. So Bilam, gives the advice that you should do something terrible, and Eov is silent. And then what's the voice of more? What does Yisro say? He just runs away. Even the good guy in the story doesn't have a voice, and that to me is always very telling. It's against this backdrop that we're introduced to Moshe, and it's shocking to people. It's difficult for them to hear. They're so unaccustomed to hearing anything that we would consider normal or healthy or hopeful or truthful, and so they're not able to hear it. But in fact, Moshe's is the voice of reason and the voice of virtue. And it's the voice that continues to be heard for the balance of the Torah and for the balance of history. Now, I'm not saying that our speaker tonight is Moshe Rabbeinu. It's not allowed. We remind ourselves every day, Lo Kam B'Yisrael K'Moshe Od. But I am saying that we're especially grateful to be able to hear the voice of Rabbi Dr. David Flatto at this time. Our country has been talking a lot about topics like the rule of law and separation of powers and the nature of democracy. There's so much chatter and there's so much noise. It's a pleasure for a change to hear an authoritative voice, a voice of clarity. So many of us consider ourselves Talmidim of Rabbi Dr. David Flatto. We've had the privilege many times of learning with him and from him at the Jewish Center, the special combination of humility and mastery. He always leaves us with so much to think about. As you know, Professor Flatto received a bachelor's and ordination from Yeshiva University, a JD from Columbia Law School, and a PhD from Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at Harvard University, PhD with distinction. He's now Professor of Law and Jewish Philosophy at Hebrew University. It's a pleasure, as always, to introduce my friend, Rabbi Dr. David Flatto.
Good evening. Thank you so much, Rabbi Levine. That was, I didn't really agree to that intro. Thank you so much. It's a little too much, but it's totally generous in the way Rabbi Levine and the Jewish Center, the community always welcomes me in, and I'm very proud to be part of the community. And thank you to everybody who came out tonight, in this freezing night, who came out to their living rooms. I really appreciate it. I give a special shout out to Rabbi Yitzi Blau, who's a mentor and a friend who is zooming in from Israel right now, which is just remarkable. And I feel like I have to step it up now. And I also want to acknowledge my family who's here. And if you're buying my book, you could buy a few books, better books. Some of them might be even harder to read than mine. You might need to learn some math for some, and some early modern Jewish history for others. So it's really nice to see everybody. I'm going to share, and I prepared a PowerPoint. Um, Are we good? Does everybody see the PowerPoint? Okay, so just a word about the title. The Crown and the Court, Separation of Powers in the Early Jewish Imagination. There was a lot of pressure from the publisher to make sure that people know about this book. So if they do Google searches right now, there should be a good chance that this book might surface in the search results. So separation of powers, we're doing great. Can the president do that to the state? Separation of powers issue. Can Congress do that to the president? Separation of powers issue. Can the court intervene? Separation of powers issue. So on that front, I'm doing well. The Crown is hitting another audience. Anybody who's searching for TV shows to look for right now on Netflix might Google The Crown. It's true there are other words that did not make it into the title. I wasn't prescient enough to have the word insurrection or impeachment or Twitter. I'm working fast on vaccines and the 25th Amendment in the early Jewish imagination. So anyway, I'm doing okay here. But kidding aside, there is something that is odd about this book. I've been working on this project for a long, long time. And it's exciting to see it out. But there's a sense where it's touching on timely issues. A friend pointed me to a Facebook post of a younger scholar who I admire, who happened to post about my book. And he said, sometimes you do research in ancient Judaism and wonder what on earth it has to do with the world we live in. Other times you are working on this book, and he pointed to my book. And there is this uncanny sense in which these timeless topics that I'm talking about touch on issues that are timely. So here, just to raise everybody's blood pressure a little bit, if you look to relax tonight, here are some photos for you. So we have on the left-hand side, the Supreme Court, and underneath that, the White House. And they have an interesting relationship or interrelationship now and for a long time. That's what I have in the bottom right. One of the bold decisions of the U.S. Supreme Court in the Nixon administration to compel from the president, then President Nixon, to produce tapes, which led to his resignation. And on top, so much has happened. This almost seems like ancient history, but just a few months ago, President Trump appointing the latest Supreme Court justice, and no doubt trying to have a certain imprint on one, in other words, Article 2, executive branch trying to shape Article 3, the judiciary. And it's not just, of course, in the United States, it's in Israel. Here we have just another set of photos that to get the juices going. So we have here maybe a little less familiar to some in the middle, the Israeli Supreme Court, and led by Justice Esther Chayut. And here we have on the left side, one of the times where Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu was sitting right near Justice Chayut, and the right, of course, the inimitable Bibi. And they, of course, have a tense and complex relationship also. So the relationship between the seats of power, the crown, or the modern versions of the crown in our societies, the president, the prime minister, and the judiciary, and the struggles between them are epic to this day. And they, of course, have a rich history. If we look in United States history, one of the pivotal turning points, and this is a classic for anybody who went to law school, The way one traditionally begins learning the subject of constitutional law in an American law school is through the study of the epic case Marbury v. Madison. And without getting into the details, which interestingly have been in the news, and you could hear about this in hearings even recently, it was after the controversial election of 1800, where it was a shift from the Adams administration. You see Adams in the top left, to the Jeffersonian administration. Jefferson wins this election. And that's a major turning point in the early history of the United States. This shift from a federalist government of Adams to the Jeffersonian approach of Thomas Jefferson and his Secretary of State, James Madison. And here you have, I think, the third Chief Justice of the United States, but the most famous one in the founding era, Justice Marshall, who's the Chief Justice for decades. And this case is really the case that puts him most on the map, where he intervenes. Technicalities of the case I'll leave for another time. It involves an appointment of a DC judge, that's Judge Marbury. But it touches on this really loaded political issue of what happens when we transition from one administration to another, and it's a major turning point. So of course this echoes with our times also, in a shift in administration. And can the court intervene? Will it have the guts to intervene? And how will it intervene? And what a lot of commentators and historians think is that was the heroism and also the genius of Chief Justice Marshall, that he found ways to intervene, but not to be over the top, and yet to assert the role of the court. And this is really what begins to inflate and elevate the importance of Article 3, the judiciary, among the leading branches in the United States. So of course, presidents have been important since President Washington, and Congress was always important. And it began really in this case of Marbury v. Madison, that the Supreme Court carved out itself a crucial and an independent and autonomous role in leading the United States. Now, those types of tensions between the branches, between the political leader, the crown or the president, and the judiciary, have an earlier history in the Anglo-American tradition. And here we could go back to the 17th century, if we want to pause at another really famous moment, and maybe a little less familiar to some here. So I'm eager to share this important piece of history, or to remind you. And that's in 17th century England. Of course, we know this is a tumultuous and pivotal century in English political history. It's really where we go from a monarchy to an empowered parliament. And interestingly, the common law courts also achieve an independent standing in this century. But of course, it is a very, it's filled with friction. It's a very tense process, so tense and so filled with friction that in the 1640s, the king loses his head. So maybe that's some type of, I don't know, called comfort, that God forbid things could be much worse. But before the 1640s, in the early parts of the 1600s, you have these showdowns between the king, King James VI, and the legendary common law Chief Justice Coke. And I want to talk about one case briefly from the early 1600s. By the way, a few years later, Coke ends up in prison. So a lot of these players pay a serious price for their role. But here, let's look together at a famous case in English history, and we have to appreciate the drama and tension of the moment. Just a little background: it involves a property matter where the king asserted his role as a judicial voice, as the ultimate judicial voice. So King James came out with a determination and a decision about a property matter, but it gets to Chief Justice Coke. So Chief Justice Coke revisits, or in a sense, appropriates control over this legal matter. And here we have a back and forth, a remarkable back and forth between King James VI and Chief Justice Coke, a very dramatic back and forth. So then the king said, and the year of this is 1607. We just have a publishing of this only in the mid 1600s. Then the king said that he thought the law was founded upon reason, and that he and others had reason as well as the judges. In other words, the king does not want to cede control over the law to the common law court and to Chief Justice Coke. To which Coke bravely looks the king in the eyes and responds. To which it was answered by me, Chief Justice Coke speaking, that true, God had endowed his majesty with excellent science and great endowments of nature, but his majesty was not learned in the laws of his realm of England, which concern the life of his subjects. They are not to be decided by natural reason, but by the artificial reason and judgment of law, which law is an art, which requires long study and experience before that a man can attain to the cognizance of it. And the law was the golden metawand and measure to try the causes of the subjects. So asserting his own role and claiming the turf of the judiciary, Chief Justice Coke looks at the king and says, back down. You might be brilliant, you might have reason, but you're not learned in the common law. That is unique to jurists, not to even philosopher kings on the most rosy of descriptions of the king's knowledge. To which the king, shocked by the chutzpah of Chief Justice Coke, looks at him and rebuts him in the following words, with which the king was greatly offended and said that then he should be under the law, which was treason to affirm. Again, look at the wording, how shocking this moment must have been and how scary it must have been for Coke and all his underlings on the judiciary. And how is Coke going to respond to this? To which I said that Bracton said, and here he quotes in Latin, so we'll skip the Latin, that the king ought not to be under any man, but under God and the law. So here are words that we could try to preserve and hold on to in our time. When there is a power play between different branches, the judiciary bravely in the early 1600 asserts that they are the ultimate speaker or arbitrator of the law because they are learned of the law, and because ideally it's not them as an empowered judiciary, but they are just representing God's will and the law. And that is traced to Bracton. Of course, this echoes in our tradition, Kihal Mishpat Lalohim Hu, and other rabbinic stories that I don't have time to get into now. So here is in the West, the moment that often is pointed to where the judiciary really begins to carve out its autonomy. But what about before the 17th century? What was the state in the West before then? So here, largely, we could learn, and this is a generalization, but now I'm gonna look at all antiquity from 2000 BC up until 1600 CE. For those 3,500 years, largely, the most powerful person was the one who controlled the law. And usually the one who was most powerful was an absolutist leader, ruler, king, emperor, and they're the ones who control the law. What's interesting in this slide that I have before us is here are moments where law flourishes in the ancient world. Here are moments where it's not just the whim of a king, it's not just the arbitrary decision of a ruler, but where ancient society and Western society achieved the culmination in the development of law. The later example from the 6th century of Justinian, the Byzantine Empire, who sponsors, as it were, and collects the Code of Roman Law, which is the masterpiece of Roman law. After a thousand years of development, it culminates in a codification in the 6th century CE. And we could go all the way back, which really is remarkable, to 18th century BCE, to the Code of Hammurabi, where there also we have a very different kind of, but no doubt impressive and inspiring code of law. And what's interesting to note about these two examples, where we have codes of law, that they are tethered to and they're attached to and they're dominated by a absolutist figure. So even this code of Roman law is a code of Roman law that's sponsored and made official and given its imprint and under the shadow of a strong Byzantine emperor, Justinian. And going all the way back to Hammurabi's code, we cannot miss the role of Hammurabi in his code. Unless we miss it, we see the stele that you could see on display to this day in the British Museum. And on top of it, in the stele, you have two figures. I'm looking on the right side of the page, and on the right, you have the ancient Mesopotamian god Shamash, the sun god. And on the same level as the sun god, no doubt praising the sun god, but standing firm on the same level, is the great king of Babylon, King Hammurabi. So this code of law is dominated by this absolutist figure, King Hammurabi. And in the famous prologue and epilogue, Hammurabi repeats over and over that he is the one who is the bestower of the law. So what I'm trying to say as a generalization is, before early modern times, before brave figures like Chief Justice Cook in the 17th century that try to carve out an independent role for the courts and an autonomy of the judicial branch, the situation for most of Western history and ancient history up until early modern times was that law was dominated by whoever was most powerful, a king, an emperor, an absolutist ruler. Now, what about in the biblical tradition, which is getting closer to the focus of my book? So here I have the beautiful rendering of the trial of Solomon by Raphael, which we all know the story of the trial. But here I'm just trying to briefly capture that in the biblical tradition too, we think of the greatest kings of Israel, and they were endowed with unique wisdom, and a unique wisdom to adjudicate and to administer justice. So Shlomo, Solomon, when he steps up to the throne, he has the dream, and God gives him the gift, the bounty of unique wisdom. And then we have the story of his ruling with the harlots. So the king is the one who administers the law in the biblical world. And of course, we know this also about David. And we know this about Avshalom. When Avshalom rebels against his father David, he tries to vayignov lev ha'am, he steals the people through administering justice. So in the biblical world, in a period of kingship, we have to assume that the way things operated was similar to the way it operated in the ancient world. The powerful ruler or king administered law. We have much greater faith in our heroic kings like David and Shlomo, etc. So we assume they use their wisdom wisely and justly, but it fits the paradigm of the ancient world that the powerful or the ruler or the crown administered the law. And yet, if we look to the Torah, in one of the most important passages in the Torah, where it talks about administering law, the Torah in Dvarim, in Parshat Shoftim, in Dvarim Yud Zayin, describes things in a very different manner. So here, let's review Dvarim Yud Zayin just a little bit together. So we have here on the top a description of what happens when you have a difficult legal matter and you need supreme instruction. If a legal matter is baffling for you, or in the Hebrew, so what do you do when you have a difficult legal matter? Any such matters of dispute in your towns, you shall immediately go up to the place that the Lord your God will choose. So you go to the temple, where you shall consult who's in the temple with the Levitical priests and the judge who is in office in those days. So you go to the priests, you go to the shofet, presumably an elder, carry out exactly the decision that they announced to you from the place that the Lord will choose. Do not stray from the word that they proclaim to you, either to the right or to the left. So ultimate adjudication, ultimate instruction comes from the temple area, from the priests, from the Levites, from the elder. And then in the next sequence of verses, the Torah describes and establishes the institution of monarchy in the only place that the Torah addresses kingship and monarchy. When you come into the land, you may indeed set over you a king, who the Lord your God will choose. When he has taken the throne of his kingdom, he shall transcribe a summary of the law on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priests. It shall remain with him, and he shall read it in all the days of his life, so that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, diligently observing all the words of the law and these statutes, and in order that he not turn aside from the commandment either to the right or to the left. So in the next sequence of verses, the Torah describes the king. But what's striking for our purposes is the king has no role in adjudication. In other words, the very chapter that describes supreme adjudication in verses 8 through 13 and assigns it to the temple officials, then next shifts to the established monarchy. What's the role of the monarchy vis-a-vis the law? The monarch does not produce the law. He does not instruct the law. Rather, he reads the law and abides by the law. Lest we miss this, the verses add a couple of points of emphasis that I think drive this point home. The king copies the law which he reads in order to abide. And who does he transcribe it in front of? In front of the Levitical priests. Right? So he writes out the law in front of the guardian of the laws. It's as if the king is submitting to the law and to the guardian of the law, the priests, the Levites, the elders. And then look at the wordplay just briefly about the right or the left. In the first set of verses, whatever the supreme judicial officials instruct, one is instructed to adhere to and not veer neither to the right or to the left. But when it comes to the king, the verses are much more suspicious and skeptical. And the verses tell the king, you king, you too, you must not stray neither to the right nor to the left. So in that usage of that terminology, the Torah is emphasizing that the king also needs to abide by the law and the Torah as interpreted by the temple officials. So let me just sum up, because this is really important. What Dvarim Yud Zayin has is what one scholar has called a double anomaly. Two things are surprising. The first thing is when it describes who controls the law, who administers the law, who is the guardian of the law. It talks about priestly and officials and elders, and it omits the king. And then the second anomaly is in the neighboring verses when it talks about the king, it again precludes or omits a judicial role for the king, and instead assigns to the king this passive role. Read the law, review the law, follow the law, and submit to the priestly officials who are experts in the law. So what you have here in Dvarim Yud Zayin is a very idyllic vision of the way things should work. And this is what other scholars have described as a type of separation, a proto-separation, an early separation. Law is controlled by priests, Levites, and elders, and politics or power is controlled by the king. The question that my book tries to explore is, what is the influence or the afterlife or the legacy of Dvarim Yud Zayin? In other words, how do you take Dvarim Yud Zayin, which has this separation, and how do you balance that along other legacies or teachings or traditions of the Tanakh, like King Shlomo as the ultimate jurist, or David as the ultimate jurist? Is the Jewish tradition one of separation, or is it one that is more in sync with the premise in ancient world that the most powerful controls the law? So here, what I will do just in our time together now is try to briefly touch on what I get into at much greater length in the book, and also try to show that there's more nuance and more subtlety. Here, I'll just paint in broad strokes. So one thinker that I turn to, and it's exciting to turn to him because maybe some of you are less familiar, it's the great scholar of Alexandria. You see his dates, Philo, who was a great philosopher and also a great scholar of the Torah. He might not have known Hebrew. It seems that he got it through reading the Septuagint, a Greek translation, and yet he was a master of the Torah, as opposed to the rest of the Bible, actually, interestingly. So here, let's just briefly look. I don't want to spend too much time on each of these texts, but let's look a little bit, and hopefully it's somewhat novel for some of you, and whet your appetites to read more Philo. Maybe look at my book, but more importantly, read more Philo. We know, some of us from Yeshiva University, that the late president of Yeshiva University, Dr. Belkin, Zichrono Livracha, was a great scholar of Philo. So here we have in his special laws, this is a book of Philo. Follow along what Philo does. He rehearses this idea that the king should write the law. But I want us to all pay attention. Does he do so innocently, or does he restate the verses in a way that shifts their import or their emphasis? And from the first day on which anyone enters upon his office, he orders, meaning in the Torah, it's ordered that he, meaning the king, shall write out a copy of the book of the law with his own hand, because he wishes that all ordinances which are laid down in it shall be firmly fixed in his soul. So why does the king write the law? I was arguing that the pshat is he writes the law because we want to make sure he abides by the law. He might have these great impulses to just be, whimsical and imperious and do whatever he wants. So no, he too needs to abide by the law. But what does Philo say? So he gets into the voice of the ideal king, and he says, why do I need to write the law? In order that after I've recorded these things in a book, I might at once proceed to impress them on my heart, and that I might stamp upon my intellect their divine and indelible characters. Other kings bear scepters in their hands and sit upon thrones in royal state, but my scepter shall be the book of the copy of the law. So notice what Philo has done here. Philo says when the king writes the law, it's actually an educational process that both metaphorically and literally is a way for him to internalize the law, imbibe the law, and then embody the law. And by embodying the law, then he rules through the law. So what Philo has done is he's restored the king to the leader of the law. The king is identified ideally and synonymous with the law. It becomes a part of him. Now, just look at the next passage. There's a little further on, and maybe some of you could help me out here. He does something curious here too. And it becomes a man who has been thought worthy of the supreme and great authority to appoint successors who may govern with him and judge with him. So he's talking about the king, and he's saying the king should also have a cabinet, as it were. He should have people who assist the king, a royal court. And what's the proof for this? For there was once a time in which Moses alone by himself decided all causes and all matters of legal controversy, laboring from morning till night. But after a time, his father-in-law came to him He gave him most excellent advice, counseling him to choose subordinate magistrates that they might decide the less important affairs. And the history and the sacred of the sacred laws contains this arrangement duly recorded for the instruction of rulers of the succeeding generations. So what's the proof text, according to Philo, that the king should have assistants and it should have a cabinet and a royal court? Who does it come from? The proof? I don't know if you guys could speak. Can you speak? I don't know if you're muted. Oh, okay, good, very good. So from Moshe. Now, that's interesting to bring a proof from Moshe about how the judiciary should be constructed. Why is that? Because normally we don't think of Moshe as a king. But in Philo's account, Moshe is the king of the Jews. Okay, so just to summarize what we see here in Philo, and we're going to move on, Philo tells over Dvarim Yud Zayin in a way that restores the king to his perch, to the top of the pyramid. Dvarim Yud Zayin does introduce a judiciary, but so does the story of Yitro. And from all of the above, we gather that the point of the king is that the king should be synonymous with the law, should embody the law, and should lead the judiciary. And there's no separate independent court. Now, in my book, I try to show that it's actually more nuanced than that, and there's more at play. But in broad strokes, Philo is restoring the king to the judicial, the head of the judicial branch. Let's briefly look at another set of texts, and this is from the Dead Sea Scroll. So now we're going back to the land of Israel, and we're going to the Dead Sea area that I know that many here have visited, where the amazing discovery of these ancient scrolls that were discovered beginning in 1947 and 11 now. There's a 12th cave, maybe 11 or 12 caves in Qumran. You see on the left-hand side actually a picture of one of the types of caves that exist in the Qumran area. And there were these amazing finds, over 1,000 different manuscripts of ancient scrolls, 2,000 years old, that were preserved because of the miracle of their being stored in that unique climate, that low, below sea level, dry climate, etc. Exactly the perfect climate. And here in these scrolls, we also have interesting material. And let's briefly just look at two passages. So one is about the King and Adjudication. And here we find another wrinkle or twist. It is the king who adjudicates, but look how he adjudicates. And this is the law on the day when they proclaim him king. And 12 princes of the people shall be with him, and 12 priests and 12 Levites, who shall sit together with him for judgment and for the law. And he shall not rise his heart above them, nor shall he do anything in all his counsels outside of them. If you pick up, it's a little harder on the English towards the end. The temple scroll here is actually citing to Dvarim Yud Zayin, to Deuteronomy 17. And it's saying in the restatement of this Dead Sea Scroll, the temple scroll, that the king is the one who adjudicates, but with a crucial and very stunning wrinkle. The king adjudicates along with a council of 36. It's a type of, if you would allow, the anachronism, which I use these types of anachronism carefully in the book, I hope carefully. It's a type of constitutional monarchy. You have a king, but it's a king with a council of 36, 12 princes, 12 priests, 12 Levites. So king plus 36, a cross section of society. And the king adjudicates, but levilti rum levavo me'echav. He cannot have a haughty heart. It is now restated, not just as a certain humble ideal not to be haughty, but it's actually a constitutional protocol. The king needs to have the consent of a council. So this is really a remarkable constitutional arrangement from the 2nd century BCE. Now, elsewhere in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have things organized differently. And here, just briefly, let's look at a different paragraph. And in this different paragraph from a different scroll from the Damascus document, we have the following, and this is the rule of the judges of the community, a quorum of 10 men. So who judges? It's a quorum, a minyan of men. Okay, that's the way that structure was also in the community. Largely, Qumran communities were male focused. It's a bit of a mystery where there are even females as members. So you have a minyan of 10. And who's the minyan of 10? This distinct minyan of 10 people. So it's 4 from the Levim and the Kohanim, and 6 from the Israelim. And they are masters in the book of Hagi. That's a little mystery what's the book of Hagi, but it seems to be the book of the laws, like from Vahagita bo Yomam Valayla. So it's the book of laws, and you have 10 judges who are the masters of it. And they have a certain age, mandatory retirement, minimum age. Again, all sorts of interesting rules and regulations. But the point I'm trying to emphasize for our purposes is who's in charge of the law according to the second paragraph? It's a quorum of 10, a type of jury, if you want to use that language loosely, made of priests and Leviim and of Israel, and no special role for a king. So in one text, you have a king, but it's a constitutional arrangement, a king and council. And in another text, you have justice being administered autonomously, separately, in the spirit of Dvarim Yud Zayin. It's about the Kohanim, Leviim, about the Shofet, elders, and there's no role for the political ruler in this second paragraph. Now let's turn briefly to Josephus. And to do justice to Josephus, here we have his dates, the great historian of antiquity. This might be a representation, imagined representation from much later times of Josephus. But either way, Josephus is a priest, and he's a Prushi, a Pharisee, and he grows up in Judea and Yehuda throughout that first century and lives this, important life around the Beit HaMikdash, and then becomes an activist, and he becomes a general, and famously surrenders and spends out his days as a glorified prisoner of war close to the emperors in Rome. So that's Josephus. And Josephus is the great author of history of the Jews in antiquity. Without Josephus, we wouldn't know very much about Jewish history in ancient times. So Josephus also in several places touches on our topic about who controls the law. Again, the topic is who's in charge of the law? Is it the ruler? Is it the king? Is it the politically powerful? Or is there an amplification and an elaboration of the cleavage that we see in Dvarim Yud Zayin, where we see 2 different addresses? Power, politics, that's the king, but justice and the law, that belongs elsewhere, to priests, to Levites, to elders, not to the king. So what does Josephus say? So to really paint the full picture, we'd have to look at a bunch of texts. So I'll limit myself just to a few texts that it really takes an argument to show how these are on point. So let me just describe it briefly. And if you're curious, you could ask me afterwards or at another point, and I could elaborate, or you could read a little bit and we could discuss. But Josephus in Against Appian, his last work that he wrote in the late 90s, which is a defense of Judaism and an apology for Judaism, and also a polemic defense against anti-Jewish diatribes, he says the following very well-known and remarkable account of Jewish polity. Some have entrusted the power of government to monarchies, other to rule of the few, other again to the masses. But our legislator took no notice of any of these, but instituted the government as one might call a theocracy, ascribing to God the rule and power. So it's Josephus who seems to coin this term of theocratia or theocracy, which we have to this day. This is a sullied term, in a lot of modern Western countries, we speak about a theocracy with great skepticism and distrust of fanatics who control the system in the name of God. But at its origins, it's actually a profound idea that Josephus is trying to express. He's trying to say that the essence of Jewish politics is not the arrangement that we see elsewhere in the classical world. Imagine he's sitting in Rome, right near the emperor, in a world that either has a major debate about should it have an imperial form or a republican form. And think of the audacity and the chutzpah to say, not A, not B, not C. Instead, the right approach is D. Aristotle, you had it wrong. Cicero, you had it wrong. What's the right approach? It's not monarchy. It's not aristocracy. It's not democracy. It's rather theocracy, the rule of God. Now, the rule of God, of course, begs the question, how does God rule? How do we know God's will? And here, what I try to argue in this chapter is that for Josephus, the answer is we know God's will through God's laws. So the instrument of theocracy is adhering to the laws of God. And it's in neighboring passages where Josephus waxes eloquent, really very movingly, about the Jewish commitment to law. This isn't Chazal, this is Josephus. Look at his descriptions. As for us, although we have undergone countless different fortunes, thanks to the changes among the kings who ruled Asia, we have not betrayed the laws even in the most extreme crises. It's almost as he's ceding the point. Politics, kingship, that's for other nations. We have the laws. And look at the next paragraph. We have trained our courage not for undertaking wars of self-aggrandizement, but for preserving the laws. While meekly enduring defeat of other kinds, whenever people force us to alter our regulations, then we undertake wars, even when it is beyond our capacity, and we hold out to the bitter end. And all of this is very, I think, moving and a bit astonishing coming from the mouth of Josephus. Josephus is the one who surrendered, didn't hold out to the bitter end. But he's saying, I think, in these passages, well, that was about a political regime. It was about a battle of ruling in the sense of monarchy or aristocracy or democracy. There we get defeated. But when it comes to our commitment to the laws, nothing can defeat us. And we'll bear out to the end in order to live up to the laws of God, the theocratic laws, the rule of God through a disciplined commitment to law. So if we think over here in terms of the model, here we don't need to talk about the crown versus the law, because Josephus is in a sense eliminating the crown, and all we have is a society that lives by law. Now I want to briefly just speak about Chazal. Of course, that's our favorite part and always gets rich and complicated and requires teasing out. And a lot of what I really try to do in this book is to try to tease out some theory, I hope carefully, and I hope, as accurately as I know how, about what do Chazal think about these questions. One of our frustrations sometimes when we read Chazal is they have so many, lasting, eternal, binding teachings and traditions about all sorts of details of mitzvot and halacha. But sometimes we wish we could get a sort of larger sense of their commitments on issues, both in terms of philosophy and theology. But there we have a lot in the Agadah. But here I wanted to try to see, is there a way to tease out some of their theory about these issues of political thought, as it were. And I think especially in terms of who controls law, I think one can. And I try to do this in several chapters. So I'm just going to try to touch on it briefly over here. And maybe it'll be too briefly. So you won't appreciate, I think, the larger scheme or system, but still I'll try briefly. So Chazal, in a couple of places in the Mishnah and the Tosefta, say some really stunning things about the relationship between the crown and the courts. So here in this Mishnah in Sanhedrin, and it's a brief Mishnah, but it's a very Again, it's a stunning Mishnah. The Mishnah says that when it comes to the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, he can adjudicate, which in context means he can adjudicate as part of the judicial system, either the Sanhedrin or the lower courts, or there, according to the beginning of Sanhedrin, there's a whole tiered system of the Beit Din, the Sanhedrin at top and lower tier courts, and the Kohen Gadol can participate, but the king may not. The king may neither judge nor be judged. Now, I'll leave the nor be judged, which is interesting, but I want to focus on that opening underline words. Melech lo dan. There will be a king, ideally. Mishnah Sanhedrin is talking about an ideal arrangement, a world of a functioning court system, a world of a Sanhedrin, a world of a Kohen Gadol, and there's also this figure of a Melech, and the Melech, this Jewish king, cannot judge. Melech lo dan. In Tosefta, Chazal formulated in a more, maybe slightly more narrow, but also more pointed manner. A king may not preside with the Sanhedrin, mipnei hachshad. It's out of suspicion. We're suspicious of that shidduch. We're suspicious of the king presiding with the Sanhedrin. We're suspicious of the king trying to administer halakha and trying to administer the law. So what's the solution? We separate. We create a barrier, a division. We preclude the king from his most native and intuitive role in the ancient world. One just has to think about, imagine telling this to the Emperor of Rome. Emperor of Rome, the jurists have announced that you're not invited into the legal system and you're actually barred and precluded. That would be unthinkable. Now, maybe the rabbis have the advantage. They could say these outrageous, idyllic things without looking in the eyes of an emperor and needing to enforce it. Nevertheless, I don't think we should deny them the impressiveness of this type of formulation. It's audacity to say that in an ideal arrangement, we will separate and preclude the king from administering the law. Now, Chazal are well aware of other arrangements. I have here on the bottom a midrash in the Mechilta where Chazal actually sound a lot like Philo, that Moshe is a royal figure who administers the law. Of course, Chazal are aware of such arrangements. That was a lot of the world around them. That was a lot of the legacy of the Tanakh that they knew. That was no doubt the history in Hasmonean times in various ways and onward. And yet Chazal, in what I would argue a more mainstream position of theirs, mainstream for them, but audacious compared to other traditions, Chazal state in no uncertain terms, Melech lo dan. The king is precluded and kept separate from the administration of law. So taking Dvarim Yud Zayin and elaborating on Dvarim Yud Zayin, two separate roles. Justice with the Sanhedrin and royal power with the king, political power with the king. And here I try to capture this in an important, I think, paragraph in the book, trying to just capture a summary of some of what I try to argue. Some of this will resonate less with what I just talked about, some more, but I'll just read all of it quickly. Sorry. Let me just clear out the space here. Okay. Instead of powerful, cultic, or charismatic individuals, institutional justice, this is what I take to be the Chazal ideal, authorizes an autonomous panel of judges to head the legal system. Consider in this regard the account of the rabbinic judiciary in the opening chapters of Mishnah Sanhedrin. Tribunals are composed of multiple judges, and the size increases for higher ranking tribunals, thereby repudiating the template of an individual dominating justice. Likewise, the tractate announces early on that the jurisdiction of the Supreme Tribunal extends to proceedings against the Kohen Gadol. The high priest may not be tried, save, i.e., he is only tried by the court of 71, the Sanhedrin. Given that in much of pre-rabbinic literature, the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, was seen as the foremost judicial authority, holding him under the authority of the leading institutional court, constitutes an assault on the paradigm of priestly justice. Finally, and most explicitly, Mishnah Sanhedrin eviscerates the paradigm of royal justice. In an astounding ruling, Mishnah Sanhedrin that we just read declares a king may not judge. In all, Mishnah Sanhedrin advances a comprehensive vision of institutional justice in place of other alternative juridical schemes. So what I try to argue is that Chazal really elaborate and develop on this division, that the seeds of this division begin in the Torah in Dvarim Yud Zayin, but Chazal embellish and elaborate on an institutional imaginary, an ideal template of how should justice be organized. And Masechet Sanhedrin is not just a relic of history. A lot of it is no doubt a utopian account, building on some history, but largely an ideal of how justice should be administered. And Chazal are emphasizing, I think, that this matters. And one of the main ways that it matters is who controls the law, who controls the halacha. And the answer is not the crown, not the king. And instead, who does? It's the courts. It's a system of courts, and no doubt in sync with the spirit or ideal that we saw articulated much later, that it's the courts who are speaking and implementing the word of God and trying to uphold the law, the rule of law, and to remove the role of an empowered individual as much as possible from that process. That at least is the ideal. Just my last slide here is just not really part of the book, but to talk about something that I'm privileged and really a bracha that I have in my position at Hebrew University, that I'm part of a center known as the Machon Mishpat Ivri. I'm certainly no expert on Mishpat Ivri, and what Mishpat Ivri is a complex topic and it's controversial, but I think there are ways where it's really important, and maybe at another time I could be invited to talk more. I'm still learning more about its role in Israeli society, a contested role. But there are ways where I think everything I just described is true to the spirit of what Mishpat Ivri ideally is about. Mishpat Ivri is about retrieving from our great tradition, from our great, from the Tanakh and from Chazal and from the Talmud and the Halacha and the Rishonim and the Achronim, ideas that one can hold on to and utilize and apply in ways that advance society in modern times. And here we have just some pictures here in the middle. We have the brilliant late Justice Menachem Elon, who's really the most important figure associated with Mishpat Ivri. On the right, you have the late Justice Chaim Cohen. And on the left, you have a picture of a photograph from a synagogue in Moscow, where I was there in the year 2018, I think it was, celebrating 100 years of the project of Mishpat Ivri. It's an idea that was developed actually in Russia and then transported to the land of Israel. And the idea is taking from the traditions of the past and thinking how they apply in a modern, liberal, Western state like modern Israel, democratic state, etc. And I think what I described tonight in much broader strokes relates to this. How we could find in our own tradition, the US tradition that we're very proud of separation of powers, tracing back to Marbury v. Madison and tracing back to England and Justice Cook. These are very important foundational tales of Western values, but we could be very proud that in our own tradition, we have a much older discourse relating to some of these ideas, tracing back to the Torah and tracing back to early Parshanut, both in the diaspora and in the land of Israel, both among sectarians and more mainstream interpreters, and even at the bedrock of our Mishnayot, committed to an ideal of autonomous system of justice, which is buffered from the intervention and from being dominated by the politically powerful. That, of course, is an ideal. The reality is often more complicated. Okay, I'll stop over there. I know that went on for a while. I would love to hear some questions or comments for those who can stick around a little bit. I see a whole chat.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Flatto, so much for your talk. There's a couple of questions in the chat. I got a couple privately messaged as well. You can take a look at some of those at this moment, but if you want, I'll share with you at least one of them so far.
Sure.
You know, to what extent are the approaches that you showed us this evening from Philo or the Mishnaic rabbis really just reflecting to an extent the environment in which they lived, whether it be Roman philosophy, Greek philosophy, or the legal traditions that are perhaps outside of Judaism, or to what extent are they contrasting those political and legal theories?
It's an important question. I think, you know, in all sorts of topics, there's a lot of influence. But here, I think there's a lot of resisting a contextual world. And here, I really think it's picking up on Dvarim Yud Zayin and elaborating. It's not just saying we have the Torah and we enforce it. It's really a model of generative parshanut, of generative interpretation, where they take an idea that's seated in the Torah and develop it through their parshanut, through their interpretation, through trying to fill out a system, partially through some historical experiences of the Jews on their own. Partially, I think there is some looking to what's done outside, but I think in the most important ways, it's resisting the outside world. So it's certainly resisting an imperial world. When it comes to Greco-Roman traditions, there's probably, it's more philosophical. There's probably more common ground, but that's less familiar, at least let's say to Chazal or the Dead Sea Scrolls. When it comes to a figure like Philo or Josephus, it's more complicated. But look at the passage I brought from Josephus, where he's sitting there in Rome and knows the classical models of political theory. I mean, that's the most basic question in political philosophy of ancient times. What is the best regime? And here Josephus, with great chutzpah, says it's not monarchy, it's not aristocracy, it's not democracy, it's a new way, the Jewish way of theocracy. And so, that captures how a lot of these traditions are resisting what's going on in the outside world. Do you want to read some more, Rabbi?
Sure, yeah. I will. Here's another question that came through. So you mentioned that the king cannot judge, quoting the Mishnah in Sanhedrin. So what exactly is the role of the king, right? Did rabbinic law limit the power of the melech further than Dvarim Yud Zayin?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't really know. That's honest. I try to deal with this a little bit in the book, that I think Chazal don't tell us so much about the king. They're not exactly Dvarim Yud Zayin. What I try to argue is in Dvarim Yud Zayin, at least my argument is that you have the Kohanim, Levim, and the Shofet, the temple officials, and the king's almost like beneath them. I would think of it as almost like a hierarchy. Like there's the pure temple laws, and then the king we're more suspicious of. I think that's more the sense of the pshat of Dvarim Yud Zayin. And I think Chazal, in a sense, are elevating the king and granting him autonomy. He doesn't judge, but he's also not judged. It's a very surprising configuration of an individual, that halacha knows of an individual who isn't judged. That's a very surprising thing. So Chazal, in a sense, are carving out a autonomous space for the king as well. I think that's for the king to do what I would put in quotes, politics. Now here I think Chazal are less interested in politics. That actually, I think they might think, oh, that's what the Romans do. I mean, that's ruling, that's sovereignty. So I don't think Chazal say much in a positive. They say a little bit, and I'm interested in this topic. I try to teach a little bit about this. They do say some things about war, and they do say some things about other things that a king can do. Again, there are no great generals, Chazal, by and large. Maybe Rabbi Kiva, Bar Kokhba, there's some of it. But largely, they don't think so much about political matters. They think some, so I wouldn't say totally. But by and large, I think they say, give the king the space to do politics. And in that sense, it's not a system, to use the modern terminology, of checks and balances. It's actually an ideal of separation without checks and balances. That sounds a little dangerous to us modern ears, and maybe it would be to implement. Again, they're pretty idyllic, their writings. They're not really living in this kind of society. So they don't learn so much from experience, more from ideals, I think.
Got it. Maybe we'll take like one or two more questions. Um,
I'm happy to stick around, but I get that some people.
Sure. Yeah, that's totally fine as well. After the Mishnah and Gemara, in terms of many of the topics you discussed this evening, do later rabbinic figures, whether it's the Gaonim or early Ashkenaz or Sfarad, do they deal with these questions, or they weren't really interested in political theory? They were more into kind of the Dalet Amot of halacha that we deal with today.
Yeah, it's also another excellent question. It's a little beyond what I talk about in the book, and the conclusion I try to paint in even broader strokes about some of that stuff. Again, I don't want to totally. I believe in this topic. I think it's an important topic. It's not. I don't know. It's political theory. I don't think it's a dominant topic for the rabbis. But I think there are forms of it, especially related to administering law, that I think mattered a lot to rabbis. And I think that continued to matter in medieval times. In a sense, in medieval times, I think politics started to matter more because of the history of trying to navigate in Christendom, in Islamic worlds, eventually developing kihilot, which have some form of semi-autonomy. So you do have forms of political thinking. There's a topic that scholars have paid more attention to. People used to assume that there was no politics until 1948. Scholars, I think, rightly have revised their approach to those questions. Jews navigating the diaspora, not just court Jews, but in general, Jews had to find ways to arrange their communities and navigate the relationship with larger host cultures. And they were creative, sometimes through, buckling down on halacha, and sometimes through finding other arrangements of parnasim and other political arrangements. I'm looking at Professor Sharon Flatto. She could tell you much more about medieval and early modern times on these fronts, but I think there is an afterlife to this story, but you have to retrieve it. They don't write political treatises. One important example where this does come up is Rabbeinu Nisim, the Ran, in Gerona, who writes a famous drasha. It's one drasha, but it's a famous homily where he describes ideally what is the relationship between the Sanhedrin and the Melech. So that's in early medieval times, and I think his account's somewhat related, somewhat different, but there's good scholarship on that stuff. For those interested, I'm happy to point you to some writing.
Great. So I think the final question that I'll pose for the evening is, when you were researching this book, as Rabbi Levine mentioned in the beginning, so often scholarship can be very, nitty gritty in the text, but who knew that in the middle of January 2021, your book would really kind of spring to life in many real ways. So if you could just reflect on what's the message from your scholarship to 2021 for everyone here this evening.
I thought I was going to get off the hook without needing to address one of the beauties of scholarship is that you could live in an ancient world, and then you realize that the ancient world had its own tragedies and crises and its own messes. So that gives us a little chizuk that we will get through hard times. I think there is, listen, I began with these slides of what's going on in the US, and then I turned to Israel, and, it's on all our minds. And I think there is, implications of my ideas for that. And that is how much it matters, how one structures society, how one structures power, how much I think Chazal expended energy. And it's surprising in a way because they talk about the jurisdiction of the Sanhedrin, and in their lifetimes they tell us very clearly that the Sanhedrin didn't have the powers they talked about and wasn't regularly constituted. And yet they thought a lot about these questions, about procedural questions, about structuring court. I wrote one place that if Chazal have an answer to what is justice, the great question that plagued Plato in his Republic and other thinkers, I think for them it's constructing the courts in a way that has integrity. And that's a really interesting answer in modern times. that the way our commitment to institutions matter. Now, that might sound a little general. It might have some, okay, but how does that play out in particular scenarios? So I certainly would not try to look to 2,000-year-old materials as eternal and timeless and precious as it is to try to answer that specific questions. We see how hard that is. But I think the primacy of those issues, how serious we have to be in our commitment to having integrity of institutions, about who controls law, and commitment to that process, how that really is going to define a just society. And I don't think we could be cavalier about what happens in the United States or in Israel on these questions. Obviously, inevitably, it's embedded in questions of, okay, so, pro-BB, anti-BB, pro-Trump, anti-Trump, etc. So, I don't want to, make light of those questions, but maybe that already is a failure, that it's sort of your political allegiance dictates what you think about the role of courts. So that's a bit of a critique of us as societies, that it really shouldn't depend on where you are politically, your commitment to rule of law and the autonomy of its institutions. So that to me is part of the takeaway of this. And I hope it inspires us to double down in our all of our civic work to take that stuff seriously.
Great, Professor Rabbi David Flatto, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Everyone really, I'm sure, appreciated the depth of your knowledge and certainly how we connect thousands of years of tradition to our lives today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everybody, and stay safe and get vaccinated. And I look forward to continuing the conversation.